Thank you, Wanda, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here. Those introductions are embarrassing. They demonstrate that at my age, Professor Emeritus really means Professor Geriatricus, and I hope I won't fail you. Actually, quite seriously, before we continue, I think I should acknowledge and draw attention to what you all know, the recent passing of Alex Colville. In particular, because the last time I gave a talk on war and art and identity, Alex Colville featured very prominently in that presentation. And I read most of the tributes today, but there was a letter to the editor in the Globe and Mail that simply said, "Mr. Colville made Canada a richer place with his art. The legacies left behind will be enjoyed by Canadians for decades to come." And this is very much a segue into my talk. I'm sure he too would understand the power of the artist in educating our society. Well, there's my title, and as any good academic, I've changed it. Constructing Memories of the Great War, Images, Messages, Reflections in this process. And what are my objectives? To comment on the role of art in capturing the essence of the Great War. To relate those thoughts to Lismer's exhibition and how he's captured the essence of Halifax's role in the Great War and the distinctiveness of the Great War. Had I seen the later submission of the comments on the strategy and the strategic importance of Halifax, I could have enlarged on that with my very great interest in naval strategy and the heartland role of the Atlantic, but that will be implied in my talk. And also to comment on the plans for the commemoration of the Great War that Wanda has mentioned. So why do we use the term the Great War? Not great in that sense, not great and powerful. And there have been several takeoffs of it. Oh, what a lovely war. Some of you might have seen that show in London. And there's Haig reviewing what was great about the war in terms of the casualty rates. And some of you might remember this terrible show, Blackadder, trying to turn it into high comedy. And that, in many ways, is part of the problem of our understanding of the war. So why was it great? Survey number 521, a response to the survey that Wanda and Milliker have been carrying out, argued it was great because of its kind in which technological innovations outstripped the ability to use them. First war was fought on a global scale, involving so many different peoples and countries. Many of the soldiers in the front lines were highly literate and conveyed the horror of their experience. And the mistaken belief, as we all know, it was the war that would end all wars. On the global scale, there it is, the green, the Allies, and then the German Entente, represented by yellow there, very few neutral countries. The scale of the Great War, deaths. The total Entente, 5.7 million deaths. The Central Powers, 4 million. Total war, close to 10 million deaths. In passing, in recent months and weeks, we've been seeing the statistics of the ongoing wars in the world, in the Middle Eastern area in particular, but certainly the Great War at the time had a major impact in our society. And it's a complex story. As I reconstruct heritage, what do we use the term heritage, the Canada Heritage Organization, the World Heritage Organization. What is heritage? Heritage is a legacy that we carry with us. In very many ways, it's nostalgia for the world that's gone past. As we all know, as grandparents, we tell our kids of how wonderful our world used to be. There's mythology, myths. And myths are not lies. Myths are not fabrications. Myths are structures that we create to live by, the power of myths to guide us for the future. It's very much, as I'll be pointing out, tied into our identity as a nation, and some people would argue as a people, as a civilized people. It's entertainment in film, in poems, in storylines and books. It's fantasy too. Sometimes the stories we create, unlike myths, are fantastic stories and creations. And for the students here who've come across the work of Baudrillard, simulacrum, hyperreality, in some ways, we take the realities and turn it into hyper-realities in order to educate us. As part of this project, Jason Kovacs, a colleague of mine, and I have pulled together this bibliography of over 3,000 items, and you run through it. items on politics and the national participations. But if you look at the totality of the conduct of the Great War, 350, the experience of the Great War, of those who went through it, 636, cultural expressions of the Great War, 510, remembering and co-memorizing, 477. A large block of the literature is concerned with understanding how that war has been represented to us. So I'm looking at this question of identity, national identity, through the themes of the narrative, the landscape, the monuments, the performance. Those are items there showing the cohesive elements of my presentation tonight. The old narratives of the war, rallying ethnicities, constructing nationalisms, the Irish-Canadian Rangers. At a time Ireland was trying to separate from Britain, Irishmen volunteered for the war, not just in the north, in the south as well, and it was advertised as part of the national objective. Vimy, as Pierre Burton and others have pointed out, had a particular role in causing national cohesion, the creation, the identity of where the majority of British immigrants, as soon as within a decade of arriving, had volunteered to fight in the Canadian Army, and they transformed them into Canadian citizens. And that perhaps most problematic area in Quebec, the concept of serving in the World War, the division of it, and yet there were many Quebecers who joined up, and it was part of our national unifying process. Canadiens Français, enrôlez-vous. And then there's the landscape, the place of conflict, captured by photography here, describing the dystopian landscape, the horrible landscape of the conflict and the living conditions, and in particular, the living conditions, as well as the horrible machine conflict over the top. And there were inscapes, the mental reconstruction of that place in literature. Goodbye to All of That by Robert Graves, Eric Maria Remarque, All Quiet on the Western Front, and books written on the poetry and experiences of the First World War. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. That was Wilfred Owen's famous poem that he wrote before he got killed in combat in March 1918. And the memoryscapes of how we remember war and how we remember the Great War. We create memory landscapes. The sword and the crucifix, the ultimate preferred symbol for many war memorials. But Tate Mackenzie, someone I'm studying, did wonderful war memorials. That one is in Edinburgh for the Scottish Regiment. And the most militarist memorial of all is near my town. This is Brockville. There's the war memorial of Brockville. He's throwing a hand grenade with a fixed bayonet ready to charge, a very militarist war memorial. And perhaps one of the most recent war memorials on the right, the war memorial to the First Nations in Ottawa as part of the process. These are the various idioms we have, and there are many more. But it's hard for us to realize, because very often the literature subdues it, there were also monumental approaches. I've spoken with someone here tonight who was saying that his grandfather served in World War I, but his own father didn't know much about it. His grandfather didn't speak about that war. That's on the left, that's my war memorial in my town. A very high casualty rate of the 5th Welsh Battalion, the Welsh Regiment. And when I was a kid, on November the 11th, I used to be standing there with all of the regiments and all the bands and all the rest. It's a clock outside the library, and that was the war memorial they wanted. They didn't want a militarist war memorial. The one I've researched and written about, and I wish I could do more research on it, is the British League of Help for the devastated area in France. Have any of you ever heard of it? It was very, very popular after World War I. Soldiers came home from the war, and they started funds for war memorials, and they didn't want war memorials. They wanted to invest in reconstructing the towns and villages and family life of the place in which they'd served. Because those of you who know the literature of World War I know, if you say you're in the trenches for 18 months or 2 years, actually you're in the trenches for weeks. And other times you're going to the local village behind the lines and staying with families, eating meals, and so on. And many of the troops came back, and they were, in fact, it became pairing of towns that now we all know in the European Union, they pair towns. But many of the regiments came back, and they paired up with the village near where they were in combat to reconstruct the town hall, or the water system, or the church. And I've examined some of these. They're very moving accounts. And then we have timescapes. We have landscapes, we have inscapes, we have timescapes, rituals of remembrance. November the 11th, the Cenotaph in London, that's the dominant one that we celebrate across the world. One of the most moving experiences I've had is driving down to Mount Allison on one November the 11th, and at 11 o'clock, all the traffic pulled over and on the side of the road, and they were listening to the War Memorial Service. The ceremony in the Menin Gate, top left, Anzac Day in Perth, Australia. And one I'm studying now, this is in Kitchener-Waterloo, which used to be called Berlin until the World War I, but they had to change their name to the most militarist title of the time, Kitchener. And now, at the present time, Germany joins the Canadians in the flag on Memorial Day as a new symbolism of attitudes following the war. And finally, we have these prosthetic scapes, thanoscapes. When I talk to my students about this, I tell them to send it home to their parents to justify how much money they pay for their fees at Queen's. New words. Representing memories in museums and in landscape, sanitized trench landscape sites and visiting cemeteries, battlefield tours. And also by many people who view it as pilgrimages going back to experience what they understand the nature of the war was. And then we come to our topic, the art of the war. Some of you might remember this book, The Canvas of War, Painting the Canadian Experience, 1914 to 45. In fact, this is one of the major authorities on the war. Laura Brandon has probably written more on the art of war than anyone that I know of. What is the role of the art of war? And we've heard tonight in our introduction about Lord Beaverbrook and the Canadian War Memorial Fund. That on the right is what he proposed his museum was going to look like, that was to house his war art. And at first he was representing this whole concept of we need a record of the war. And his basic thesis was that war is part of our identity. There's a whole literature on it. Nations make war, but wars make nations. It's called the cultivation of identity, the identity transition. So we have the heroic recollections of war. The present government is making much of the 1812 war, and that the heroism and the role in us distinguish ourselves from America to the south. We have the heroic charge, Flowerdale's charge in World War I as well. These are the heroic scenes. But Beaverbrook was concerned that the new technology of photography was certainly recording the war vividly. And there were exciting shows in 1914-15 of the photography of World War I. But he wanted a more romantic view. He was very suspicious that film wouldn't last, that film would decay. He wanted a permanent oil on canvas representation of war. And the artists that were first employed in that process were British artists. Nevinson's Paths of Glory. Nevison again, The Harvest of Battle. Paul Nash, Over the Top. John Singer Sargent, Gassed, painted in 1919 after the war, but representing the nature of that war. And there was also the home front, as we heard tonight, that Arthur Lismer would be involved in this. There was a concern also, and all of these records are in the archives, of the artists who were hired to record the role of the war on our home society. And in particular, you see the strong feminist element there, the role of women in producing armaments and feeding the country. But what was increasingly coming through in all of this is the artistic commentary on war. Art, is it simply a document and a record, or is it a powerful tool? And artists were painting there's the cavalry passing through the destroyed buildings in Ghent. There we have the Clausen recording the families returning home to destroyed homes. Some 10 million civilians were moved from the combat zone. then the representative of the solitary crosses and so on. If any of you, well, I've been driving through the battlefields, and it's remarkable how many small personal monuments you see apart from the official national and regimental ones. One particular person that I've studied is Mary Ritter Hamilton. She went into the trenches after the war, a woman artist in the trenches right after the war. In fact, the Indian regiments and some of the Chinese coolie regiments were still there, helping clean up. The poppies in the chalk trenches, the villagers going to a destroyed church, farmers starting to dig the land, and villagers on the bottom right there returning home in processions to reclaim the towns that had been destroyed by the war. And then we had Varley himself in the war, 1918, with that wonderful image, For What? He painted it and wrote about asking the quintessential question, what was the war all about? As there's the sapper digging the graves clearing the battlefields. And A.Y. Jackson with his image of the cops. What to paint was a problem for the war artist. There was nothing to serve as a guide. The impressionistic technique I'd adopted in painting, as in France in the pre-war, was now ineffective, for visual impressions were not enough. I'll comment more about that image again in a moment. And it wasn't just the British, and not just the Canadian. There was a very strong German, and I don't think we know much about it in our culture and society. This is Otto Dix. On the left, we have that image of the returned veterans with all their prostheses, lacks of legs, playing cards and so on, the horror of the trench warfare, and then the casualties after the war, unable to secure a living. It wasn't just a British-Canadian sensitivity. And the whole point in my presentation is, of course, famous art critic Mitchell making the point about art. Landscapes are verbs, not nouns. We think of a landscape not as an object to be seen or a text to be read, but as a social process by which social and subjective identities are formed. Art, in other words, is part of our creative process. So this brings us to Arthur Lismer, the subject of our talk, 1885 to 1969. What was his perspective before he came to Halifax? And I should point out, do any of you remember this presentation in 1982, Arthur Lismer by Gemi Kelly? It's a wonderful presentation, and she kindly sent me the book of that presentation. She was a fine authority on Lismer and Halifax and the war, and I relied very heavily on this presentation. But my theoretical approach is that if Arthur Lismer is a man with a birth and death date, I want to understand his ideas. I want to understand his experiences. I want to understand the place in which he lived. That's very much going back to Alex Colville today. He's always said he painted the place where he was. And I always want to understand what was his mission. And his mission isn't simply artistic representation. I'm trying to argue tonight there are profound philosophical images behind his presentation. That's where he was born, Sheffield. Dark satanic mills, dense urban concentrations of people. But in many of the industrial parts of Britain, behind it there were the moors and the hills, and that's where people retreated to, walked to, enjoyed nature behind. And that was his place. He was in school there. He was part of an art program there. But he was influenced there by, when you understand his background and his reading, he was influenced in particular by two lines of thought. John Ruskin, I don't know if any of you have read much about John Ruskin, giving the present 2013 concern with our economy and our values in our society. I'm rereading Ruskin, and he was writing prior to the Industrial Revolution and concerned with what society was going to be like through the Industrial Revolution. And Arthur Lismer was very familiar with his work, and in particular with the role of art and teaching and learning. And then, of course, to the right, the great theosophist. And theosophy is going to come through strongly in my talk tonight. But Kelly quotes Arthur Lismer saying, art, and this is very much derived from Ruskin, art is the normal and rightful heritage of every individual. The popular belief that there is no place for art in the life of the masses, the uneducated, unwashed masses, should be given active opposition by those of us who experience pleasure and benefit from a participation in its different phases. And then there was Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the famous founder of theosophy in our Western world, together with Walt Whitman. And they were very much part of the school that when Lismer was in Halifax, the whole school of the eclectics that read their works and studied their works. And Whitman in particular liked the idea that Canada and North America should break away from European views, European values, European artistic structures. And McCann made the quotes Lismer as saying, "The artist is making us nationally conscious with our environment setting a stage for true nationality." This is the theme coming through in Lismer's work. Even when he was here painting the dazzle ships in Halifax, it was still in his mind. There were two other characters, very progressive for their age. Edward Carpenter, a flamboyant gay in the late 19th century, advocating socialism, advocating freedom in all forms and aspects of life. And Cunningham Graham, founders of the Socialist Party, the Fabian Society, and Arthur Lismer was very involved with these as well. And then off he went in 1906. Before he came to Halifax, before he came to London, he went to Antwerp. And there he looked at those skies. He studied the skies of Constable. He was very impressed with Impressionism and Cubism. We'll come back to those themes in a moment. In 1911, he moved to Toronto. And when he moved to Toronto, he took his newspaper sketching experience he'd had in Sheffield, and he went and he got employed in the Grip engraving company in Toronto. And the members of the Grip were the foundation members of the Group of Seven. There's Lismer, there's A.Y. Jackson, they're all there. And of course, Tom Thompson, who wasn't a member of the group, who got killed in 1917, was very influential on his personal development. But while he was there, you see, in 1913, you might have read about this, some of you know about this, there was the Scandinavian link, the Buffalo exhibition of 1913. And Harris, looking back, made the point, here were paintings of northern lands created in the spirit of the lands. Here was a landscape seen through the eyes, felt in the hearts, and understood by the minds of the people who knew and loved it. Here was an art, bold, vigorous, and uncompromising, embodying direct experiences of the earth. This is what prompted that image of the left there of a train going through the forest is an image of their own Shield country and the wilderness, and it inspired the Canadians. And Lismer, typical Brit like myself, in the first year he gets here, he goes out in a canoe with a friend. In this case, it was Tom Thompson, and he describes the first night spent in the north and the thrilling days after were turning points in my life. The bush, the trails, lakes, waterfalls, moving camp from one wonderful lake to another, portage and tent pitching, fishing and sketching, and above all, the companionship of a great individual, a wonder with canoe, axe, and fish line, and he could have also said brush and canvas as well. This is what Lismer painted in 1914, the famous Guides Home, Algonquin. For the Group of Seven, the colors of the fall, the colors of the forest were the same that stimulated the French Impressionists, the Midi, the colors of southern France, and so on. It was this that impressed Lismer. Now, Lismer arrives in Halifax from London in 1916. Sir Edmund Walker from Toronto to Halifax in 1916. Sir Edmund Walker had been familiar with his work in Toronto, and he recommended him to the Victoria School of Art and Design, one of the promising among the younger artists who were developing a real feeling for the Canadian landscape. He came with a strong recommendation. And immediately, in 1917, can you imagine us doing this in our young careers? The Halifax Herald commented on the exhibition of Canadian art that he'd mounted within a year of being here. It may be said here that Mr. Lismer's personality is already telling. Although he spent but a few months with us, in an increased number of students at the school and increased interest on the part of the province of its work within a year. And this is the theme going through Lismer's life, his role as a stimulant of art in Canada, and in particular of education. But he did paint the local countryside. He did go out and paint the landscape, and he was looking at that harbor, looking at the stimulus of the harbor. But as was pointed out in the exhibition tour we had, the dominance of the sky in these early works, 4/5 of the painting, the sky. And he had a particular attraction. Norman Wilkinson had done the research on the role of the dazzle, not just for submarines, but for gun sights and so on. It was thought to throw them off. And Picasso, when he saw it, he claimed it. He said, "We did that." But Picasso's art, he thought that he should be given credit for that dazzle objective. But someone asked in the question and answer period, did Lismer paint the explosion? Of course he did. He sketched it, he represented it. In my view, the war comes to Halifax. This, in many ways, is his exposure to the war, because it is the war. You all know the details of the collision of the ships, the nature of the explosion. You've all heard that statistic. It was the most powerful man-made explosion in the world until Hiroshima. It was a tremendous disaster. 2,000 killed, 9,000 injured, 199 blinded in that exposure. I couldn't help but thinking as I was working on this, I've been living through this last week as you had, the account of Lac Mégantic, not in the same scale of numbers, but in the proportion of the deaths in Mégantic to the size of the community. There's a tremendous impact in that community. And it made me wonder if there was such a thing as a communal post-traumatic stress. Can a community, a society suffer it, as we now know troops do, soldiers do, both in war and in civilian activities? The representation in the Canadian Courier, the 22nd of December 17, represented it, and I'll be reproducing some of those quotes there. "Now death, the city sits solitary, that was full of people. Now is she become as a widow, she that was great among the nation and the princess among the provinces." Then a special edition came out a week later that Arthur Lismer, and it refers in the quote on the left, principal of the Halifax Art School, they said, "These quick-fire sketches were made on the spot. They were finished on a desk of coffins. They tell the story better than photographs. The camera is a machine." This anti-photography theme coming through again. "It feels nothing. The artist puts into his impressions himself as he was powerfully affected by the heart-rending scenes he depicts. He's representing the Halifax explosion as an artist subjectively." I won't say much about it. Look at the images that he sketched, how he captured the landscape of the war in Halifax. And there are many of these that we can look at. I've selected some. "Heaven," they say, "is kind at last, and heaven sent to Halifax a cruel, blinding blizzard so that people who trembled in its grip because they were alive might not see clearly those ghastly caravans of the dead to the suddenly improvised places of assembly called morgues." The hour of horror in devastated Richmond. One mother. Now, all these are small things compared to the awful damage. The small things commenting on the damage that had been done to his studio and art collection. And he said, the awful damage and death toll in the devastated area. That is indeed a woeful sight. And our 20,000 homeless, we're all caring for them, and the numerous blinded people, and the little children, a sight of those would depress the tenderest soul. My school is full of coffins now and boarded up. I want to do more research into his and other reactions to the reality of this experience. And there's the connection to what was going on across the Atlantic. He says in this Canadian Courier series of articles, a skyline, not somewhere in France, but almost anywhere in Halifax, linking World War I and the landscapes of the warscape to the domestic home of Halifax. So this was, in my view, Lismer's own home front. He was getting up in age by this time, 29, 30, 29, and here he was, with the war had come to him. So in 1918, he wrote to Eric Brown in Ottawa and said, trying to argue that he should be painting the home front. More than any other city, perhaps in the Dominion, Halifax is of vital interest as a war city, and there's a tremendous amount of activity that I'd like to record. the departure and arrival of troop ships, convoys, hospital ships, troop ships from Australia, New Zealand, and the States, camouflaged men of war in different nationalities. It's intensely interesting and graphic, and no one is painting it. And then, as we were introduced to it in the pre-lecture discussion, he had a rough time. Can you imagine the attitude in Halifax after the explosion and knowing the war and getting daily reminders of the casualty list from the front? And there were guys going around sketching and painting all of the strategic sites. And he said the public make it a little unpleasant occasionally. They don't understand. One of the local papers is lashing up an argument against landscape painters having access to docks, etc. I've been frequently reported as a suitable subject for internment. People who were previously cordial to me have discovered that I'm a suspicious character. It was tough work trying to paint the war in Halifax. But he did, as we saw in the display. Convoy in the Bedford Basin, look at the sky. The transport Aquitania, capture the activity. Look at the people lining the rails, all the decks going up if you look closely, the tugs working, the toll taking place. Departing troop ships, the symbolism of the departure and the emotion of people waving goodbye. Minesweepers in action, and as some of you know, he served on the, he went, not served, he observed on the minesweepers. Point was made out, he had some naval officers take sketches, but he went on board himself. I've also read he even went on a submarine. I probably understand why he didn't go into one of those early aeroplanes at that time to experience that war exposure as well. The dazzled ship at night, capturing the essential protection in the dark. And then peace, the Olympic with returned soldiers, which he talked about, the end of the war. Home again, the Olympic, which has carried so many of the Canadians over, docked here last week. A magnificent sight, most typical of all such subjects. There'll be many such, of course, and I shall have a good opportunity to study them. He was very much concerned with his role as a recorder, even though the artistic temperament comes through and the artistic creativity through, he was a document maker. And this comes through with A.Y. Jackson. When A.Y. Jackson came back from the front, and he had seen the horrors of the front, and he joined in 1919. He joined Lismer in 1919. And Lismer makes the point, I'm very much interested in war records, but there are times when I'd like to let go at something and forget the facts, making the point he'd been recording facts. To be really honest, with the stuff means that everything should be put down as it happened. It has to be absolutely correct as to wind, weather, and tide. And then he comments on A.Y. Jackson. I think Jackson prefers the Western Front, where you can put your subject under any such scheme you wish. I think his language is wrong there. Artistically, he had freedom there, but I don't know if Jackson would say he preferred the Western Front. This is my favorite of Lismer's paintings. Convoy at Sea, but it was painted after he left Halifax, but he painted it, but it's still his World War subjects. Guess where he painted it for? Who requested this? Do any of you know? The Regina Boat Club, the Regina. Now, how far away from the ocean can you get? But our colleagues in the Navy will help me on this. I understand that in the war, World War I and World War II, a very large proportion of naval people came from the territories. Is that myth or is that reality? Have you heard this? But anyway, Regina wanted this to commemorate those who had given their lives in World War I in the Navy. And then again in the post, after he left Halifax, when he's a member of the Group of Seven, all of these trees are symbolic, patriotic pines. The famous West Wind for Tom Thomson, and Lord has made the point, but for the artists and the public who had recently been given an unforgettable demonstration of courageous tenacity at Passchendaele, the identification, stark drama of the land with the essential character of Canadians was irresistible. The Canadian Corps had strengthened our confidence in our abilities to fight as a nation. Here were paintings to express that heightened spirit of struggle. So many of them engaged that idea of life with roots in rock, battered by wind, battered by waves, and yet essentially a Canadian characteristic. Lismer, in 1921, painted September Gale, Georgian Bay. And he said, it mirrors the struggles of mankind, and that the northern Canadian landscape in particular reflects the heroic efforts of the Canadian people. His image of the war transcended Halifax as part of the national project. In 1919, he had an offer of a job in the Ontario College of Art, and he returns to Toronto. He said he wanted to get back with his colleagues now coming back from the war, the people he'd been interacting with before the war. He had said he left that most beautiful province, Nova Scotia, and he did revisit it, as we know. There's some of the early paintings he had of Nova Scotia with the log drive. And he was back into the group of 7. Yes, I know, my arithmetic is pretty good, but there were so many in and out of the group of 7, including Thompson, who died in 1917. And Lismer joined in with A.Y. Jackson, and A.Y. Jackson said, "But though life is full of sad disappointments, we'll play the game and go treasure hunting yet in the Northland." When he came back from the war, he went up to the north and out to the west, and Lismer went with him. Those are Lismer's pieces, by the way, there, and he didn't like the overarching, domineering landscape of glaciers and peaks. He preferred more subtle landscapes. And then there was the very first exhibition of the Group of 7 in April 1920, and they declared the time had come when these young men plainly felt that they should together present their discovery of what was for them a truly Canadian art style. Walt Whitman had persuaded them. When Canadians, after their experience in the First World War, had a new sense of maturity and were searching for distinctive symbols of Canada. Lorne Harris, describing his images of the North, it seems that the top of the continent is a source of spiritual flow. Think theosophy, the spiritual socialism of Madame Blavatsky, into the growing race of America. And we Canadians, being closest to this source, seem destined to produce an art somewhat different from our southern fellows, an art more spacious, of a greater living, quiet, perhaps of a certain conviction of eternal values. We were not placed between the southern teeming of men and the ample replenishing north for nothing. In many ways, if you want to go further into it, I'm not going to do it tonight, it gets into the contemporary immigration experience at that time and immigration categories, keeping out blacks, keeping out Asiatics, keeping out Southern Europeans. It is influencing policy as well. And last year, 2 new books came out. Inward Journey, The Life of Lorne Harris by James King. Vanguard of the New Age, The Toronto Theosophical Society by Gillian McCann. 2 books, I was asked to review them, and both have exactly the same cover image on the covers selling the books. Anyway, and what does King say? He quotes Lismer on page 130. Lismer says, "No country can ever hope to rise beyond a vulgar mediocrity where there is not an unbounded confidence in what humanity can do. The artists here represented make no pretense of being the only ones in Canada doing significant work, but they do most emphatically hold that their work is significant and of real value to the country." Lismer, the nation builder, nation thinker. And in McCann's book, Lismer's quotes in several places there, "The artists make us nationally conscious with our environment, setting a stage for true nationality. Art is a reflection of God's purpose." He doesn't specify which God in this context. "It is necessary as Canadians we should believe that we are capable of producing fine art." And he carried on painting nature, the Isles of Spruce. He carried on painting pine tree and rocks, trees struggling up in the rocks. He painted the Quebec village, Saint-Hilaire, and some of you might depict those rays of influence above the church, theosophy-like, as came out of the icebergs of the north. And in particular, he started looking at, and then he came and visited Nova Scotia again. And he made the point that the Group of 7 never looked at their foregrounds. But he says, "We gradually got interested in fishing gear, killocks and buoys and ropes and so on, which were marvelous stuff to paint, and my distances, if I can talk about it in my own way, were brought forward to the foreground, and the sea and sky became merely backgrounds to foregrounds." Compare that image of where the horizon is now 1/5 sky, 4/5 subject. "I was painting things with rather carefully studied arrangements of heaps of litter on a dock." And there is fishing villages, and you can see what he says exactly in reconstructing the quality of life, the way of life, the structure of life in his study of the foreground. But in 1936, all was changing. The Group of Seven closed itself off. It now formed the Canadian Group of Painters in 1936. Lismer says, it's a stagnation for painters to look backwards. That is why this exhibition is different from other painting exhibitions in Canada. No dead official portraits or waxen effigies, no pretty, peaceful vistas or posy still lifes. And Arthur Lismer carried on with the didactic role. There we have a class in 1936, looking at one chap in the right there looks bored stiff, but there he is being introduced by art. And here we have Lismer again. No man was ever more dedicated to opening the eyes of children to beauty and freeing their imaginations. He'd have liked to make all Canadians, old and young, responsive to art. He wrote books on Canadian painting, Canadian art, that were distributed throughout the schools. And then he did the Canadian nationalism too, the thing of communicating Canadian history to schools. This is in Humberdale College, this is the Lismer Hall, and they make the point, the story of Canadian values, exploration and settlement is continually retold to his students by this mosaic as they take part in assembly exercises under the colorful Lismer creation. And Linda Milrod, director of the Dalhousie Art Gallery in the summing up the 1982 exhibition, said the impact of Arthur Lismer's tenure in Nova Scotia during World War I is strongly felt in Halifax and elsewhere in the Atlantic region. He's fondly remembered as a wise and diligent teacher, an artist of strength and vitality, and a kind and generous friend, as well as the painter of dazzler chips. So in conclusion, what next? These are my reflections. We know that we have this upcoming Great War Tourism Research. We're going to have this commemorative event. We have a symposium that's going to be held in Halifax in May. They'll be presenting the results of the ongoing survey, or the analysis of the survey, and a reflective interaction, discussion, and idea generation on how Canada can and should remember and commemorate its Great War heritage. And what is the role of tourism as pilgrimage, tribute, and education? And Arthur Lismer is part of this memory project. What were his contributions? He captured the wartime landscape of the port of Halifax during the Great War. He recorded the particular exposure of a civilian population to a byproduct of that war, and that's my image, that's my view of the role of the explosion on his identity. He reflected on the role of war art on national art and national identity. He said specifically that he knew during the time that the war art was going to influence the Canadian imagination. And furthermore, he educated Canadians on the role of art in society. So as Brandon says, Lauren Brandon says, Arthur Lismer was aware that the war experience of Canadian artists will have a great deal to do with the development of our art in Canada. He was right. He was very much part of it. And I like his memorial stone in the McMichael Gallery. There's the memorial to Arthur Lismer. He was a rock in the creation of our national identity. Thank you very much.